Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 10,000 watt Generac generator. It is powered by a Subaru Robin 18 horse V-twin engine, and for its age of about 25 years, this seems to be in pretty good shape. Of course it wouldn't be here if it didn't have a problem. And this one has a bit of a story. So a local subscriber, Jay, bought this hoping to fix it up and sell it for profit. And he did clean it up. This machine was covered in barn dust, had the usual fuel problems, so he got it up and running. He says the engine sounds good, the generator makes power, but that excitement was short-lived because about 30 seconds into it, the engine stalled out and oil and fuel bubbled out of the carburetor. So, he cleaned up that mess, got it restarted a few times, and every single time it shut down with the same problem. So the goal today is going to be to find what the problem is, fix it, and get this machine running right again. So let me set up a little bit better and get going on this. So let's start just by checking the oil. And if the oil's overfilled, it could definitely cause a problem like that. Although I would expect to see a lot of smoke out of the exhaust as well, and he didn't mention that. So yeah, the oil, it appears to be full, right to the full mark, but let's just double check. Yeah, the oil looks good. If anything, it might be a touch overfull, but it shouldn't be enough to cause a problem. Yeah, it would have been nice if it was just overfilled oil, because that is an easy fix. That said, though, there are still a few possibilities, at least as far as an easy fix goes. The engine does have a crankcase breather. It's usually a tube that runs from the engine to the airbox. So if that is clogged or kinked, that potentially could cause this issue. We also have an external fuel pump, which, of course, has fuel running through it, but it also runs on engine pulse. Right there, it's connected to the engine. So if something has failed internally here, it may possibly mix oil with the fuel and cause the problem. Now, the other possibilities, I think they're all internal to the engine. Either worn rings, damaged piston, damaged bore, or maybe a blown head gasket. So, whatever the case, I think I want to replicate the issue before digging too deep on this one. So, before I get the engine started, I actually want to pull the tank off, because if fuel and oil are coming out of the intake, that is a fire hazard, and I don't want to damage this tank because they are very hard to come by. So we'll get that removed, and while we're at it, we'll get this protective bar and the handle removed as well. So before we can get the tank off, we do need to disconnect the fuel line from the tank that runs over to this pump. So I'm gonna just take a sample of fuel. I think there is some fuel in the tank. And there's actually a fuel valve on the tank, so let me open that up. The fuel tank must be empty. I opened the valve. This is all that came out, and I think that was just in the fuel filter. So definitely not fresh, but no oil mixed in with that fuel. So let's get the tank off. Yep, that is an empty tank. And that bushing on the bottom of the tank has a big split in it. So this tank is going to leak before much longer. So, assuming we get the generator or the engine to run right, we're going to have to circle back and get that fixed up. All right, and we're in, or at least we have better access. So we'll get the airbox cover off. And the air filter, Jay said, is oil soaked from the issues that are going on with this machine. So he didn't want to buy a new one just to have it soaked again until the issue is figured out. So this carburetor, it's very similar actually to the ones they use on the V-twin Vanguard engines. And the breather is actually right here. So yeah, so potentially if there's a lot of blow-by or a lot of oil coming out of there, it would get sucked right into the intake. So for testing, we're going to leave this airbox off so we can see if that is in fact the issue. And of course we can't do anything because this is electric start only. And the battery doesn't crank the engine. Although I do hear, sounds like the solenoid clicking. Yeah, that is the fuel solenoid, but not enough to get that starter to engage. So let's test the battery real quick. Assuming that's bad, we'll swap it out with a known good one. Yeah, 8.07 volts. So let me crank the engine. We'll see where that drops to. Yeah, there's no juice in that battery. Less than a volt when trying to crank. So a new battery should fix that issue. That one was loose. That wasn't helping anything. All right, the battery's connected and the choke's open. So I'm going to leave it that way. There could be some fuel in the carb. I don't quite want it to start yet. Just want to make sure the engine cranks. And it does. Sounds good when turning over. So I'm going to plumb up the test tank and then we'll try to start it. All right, let's give this a try. I've got the light plugged in and turned on. I've also got the external fuel plumbed in and turned on, so we are ready to go. So I'm going to position you right about here. Keep an eye on the light. We want to see that it makes power. We'll listen to the engine, see how it sounds. And I think most important, let's keep an eye on the intake and see if anything unusual happens. All right, let's give this a try. And I apologize for the noise. I have the exhaust fan running. I'm not sure how long this is going to take. So let's get it started and find out. All right, it's been about 20, maybe 30 minutes since that test. I had to vacate the area and just let the exhaust fans kind of move some air around because there was a lot of carbon monoxide produced in the 3 minutes that this machine was running. So I guess we'll start with the good. The engine started very easily. It sounds healthy and the generator is making power, but that was short-lived. The engine did start to run rough, like it was being overfueled. And the running rough continued to get worse. After about a minute, I noticed blow-by coming from the breather tube. The odd thing, though, is that the blow-by didn't look like oil. It actually looked like water, just judging by the smell and the surface tension that it had, as well as the color. And actually, since I've been gone, it has mostly evaporated, so maybe it was fuel and might be related to the running rough. And I think maybe the icing on the cake here is that when I left, I did not shut the fuel valve off, and we have formed a puddle under the machine. And if you look over here, you'll see there is a little line right there that is dripping fuel. So that line runs up to the carburetor. I'm not sure if it's the drain line or potentially the overflow, but I think we have carb issues. That might be the root cause of the problem here. So let's just check the oil real quick, make sure it's not milky like there's water in there. You know, likely we're going to have to change that if it's washed down with fuel. But let's fix the fueling problem before doing that. So I'm going to get the airbox base off. We'll get that carb uninstalled and take a closer look. All right, let's just double check the oil. Make sure there's no water contamination. And no, the color looks good. You know, if there was water in there, it would look like a vanilla shake or like milk chocolate. Although it does look a little bit thinned out. So the dipstick, it's not actually going all the way down. There we go. I just want to get the most accurate read on the level. Yeah, it's hard to tell, but it looks like it's right about there, and the full mark is there. And it smells like bad fuel. So the oil, I think it is contaminated with fuel, and it has to be changed. But let's fix the source of the problem first, and then we'll circle back to the oil. So that line that we saw underneath, it's actually right here, and this is the drain screw. And it was mostly tight, but not completely. So I'm willing to bet it's not leaking now. But you can see it is very wet around the carburetor. So yeah, we're in this far. Let's just pull it off and make sure everything looks good before doing any more testing. So the carb, it's been sitting here a minute, and it's formed a puddle underneath it. So it's definitely leaking from somewhere. It shouldn't be doing that, you know, even though it's at a slight angle, unless the bowl is overfilled. So there's a drain right there, which actually wasn't too tight, so potentially that's the issue. All right, maybe that's not a drain. Nope. That is a passage, and we're dripping more fuel. So let's get the top off. Just 4 GIS screws. All right, looks pretty clean. Gasket, thankfully, is intact. And the level isn't super high. I guess I thought it was going to be overflowing given that we're leaking. Although, interestingly enough, yeah, it's coming from the needle. So, yeah, I guess the needle is open. The color of the fuel also does not look good. So let's get the float and the needle out. And that screw is actually loose. Interesting. So I did turn it out a little bit, but it was not tight. So maybe the carb was just flooding over. Needle looks good. Let's dump this fuel out. And we're still seems like we're leaking a little. Yeah, looks like the stuff that was in the tank. So carb body doesn't look bad. We have the pilot jet right there, a fuel solenoid which blocks the main jet down there at the bottom. And, you know, we have the fuel inlet and then some passages. So overall, this carb doesn't look bad at all, but I'm going to run it through the ultrasonic anyway. You know, make sure everything is clear. You know, we're going to test it as well, just make sure that the needle and seat are forming a good seal before we put this back on the machine. And one other thing worth noting, we do have a custom gasket that isn't quite aligned. You can see it's cutting off the flow. And the even more strange thing here is that idle is right there and full throttle is right there. And if you look at the butterfly, that is idle. That's full throttle. So yeah, I've got to imagine that's by design. Most likely this carb is capable of running a much larger engine. But that is pretty odd. So I'm going to remove this gasket. I want to make one that fits better. And actually, let's get the fuel solenoid off as well before we soak this in the ultrasonic. All right, and that's pretty much it. You know, there is a main jet down there, but I have never been able to get those out on this Nicky carb. So I'm not going to try. I'm just going to damage it, but it can still be cleaned right where it is. So let's run through all these passages, give it a quick soak, and we'll put it back together. Just make sure it's no longer leaking. All right, so the carb is nice and clean and ready to put together. There is some corrosion in the bottom of the bowls. You know, that is something that the ultrasonic cannot clean up, but it's not loose and it should not cause a problem. But what I'm more concerned about is the full throttle. Like, it just doesn't seem right. So we'll know for sure when we do the load test if it's able to produce the 18 horsepower. You know, I did go online, try to locate pictures of this carb, and they were far and few between, but I did find one actually on AliExpress. I'm not sure if it was an OEM carb or not, but it looked like it was in the full throttle position, and the throttle plate seemed to be in the same spot. So I think I'm going to leave this alone unless we find that there is an issue with it. So really, I'd say the only smoking gun is that the pin that holds this down wasn't fully secured. This screw was loose, and potentially because of that, the needle wasn't seating fully. So let's get this back together. You know, we're not going to know until we try it out. All right, I'm going to test the function of the needle. We don't need the top on to do that. So it's connected to fuel. I just opened the fuel valve. You can see the fuel coming in. Though to be honest, it's not very fast. You know, for an engine this size, that might be too slow. So potentially we do need to make some adjustments, but let's just leave it like this for a few seconds, see if the flow shuts off. Yeah, it looks like the flow did shut off. So we'll check back in 5 or 10 minutes, just make sure that height is stable. And yeah, the height is stable. It's been 5 minutes, so I'm going to loosen the screw up a little bit, just simulate kind of what I found. It's probably like that. And it does still appear to be stable. But we'll check back in a few minutes. It's been 5 minutes, and even with this screw loose like it was, it had no negative effect on the way the needle works. So I think I've seen enough. We can get the lid back on. And the gasket that didn't fit right, I noticed if you flip it over the other way, it fits perfect. So I'm just going to reuse that. So that's how the gasket was. But if you flip it over, it fits perfect. All right, so before we get this started again, I do want to change the oil. The drain plug is right there, easy enough to pull out. The issue is filling it back up. The dipstick hole is pretty small and not really meant for that purpose. Instead, there is a cap right here. The problem is the handle is broken clean off. So although I'm sure we could extract that cap, I'm not sure I have another one to take its place. So yeah, maybe we can get it in that little passage there. Otherwise we're going to have to pull the valve cover and fill it that way. Oh yeah, look at that. Jeez. Well, that might be why there's blow-by. That is a high percentage of fuel and obviously very little viscosity, so that would have been for sure blowing by the rings. And let's see how much of this came out. The engine's supposed to hold, I think, 1.5 liters with an oil filter change. And it looks like we're going to be pretty close. So that right there is a liter. And I'd say we have maybe 200 or 300 left in the pan. So let me empty this out and we'll just see exactly how much we pulled out of that engine. Yeah, another 350. So yeah, that makes sense. There's obviously some of this left in the oil filter. I don't think I have a filter for this engine, but maybe we should just at least unscrew it and empty out its contents. No, that is on there tight, and I can feel the walls of the filter flexing and bending. So I really don't want to damage this filter. That'll end the night pretty early. But I do have a few filters for Generac generators. Not with a Subaru engine though, so I'm not sure if they're compatible. So let me just take a second, make sure I have a replacement before I use excessive force. All right, I think we're in luck. I have a Wix filter that I bought for a Generac XG8000 that I ended up not needing. But according to the oil filter cross-reference site I was looking at, this one does cross over to that. So all we need to do is swap these out. We should be good to go. There we go. Yeah, it looks like an OEM Robin filter, so that could be original to the machine. And it was actually empty, so we probably could have left it alone. But given its age, probably not a bad thing to swap it out. So I think I am going to try to get this cap out. If that doesn't work out, then likely I'm going to try to pull these bolts out of this rusted valve cover. It should probably be replaced anyway. But let's try to do it the proper way first before resorting to pulling the cover. And now. That's not working. Let's try a brass drift. It's a little bit less sharp. Actually, we did break it free. Good. I thought for a second I just broke it. All right, let's check the oil level. Assuming we can get the dipstick all the way down. It's still up a little bit. Okay, it is down. And yeah, maybe a little bit overfilled. But the oil filter, it is empty, so that should even out once we crank the engine. So yeah, let's get the cap back on. I'm going to crank the engine with the choke off. We'll just build some oil pressure. And then we'll try to start this again. So as far as this plug goes, I mean, technically it was still sealing. I guess my concern is if I put it back in there, can I get it back out without this piece of plastic breaking apart? So I was looking around, and actually I'm working on a pressure washer right now, and this plug came from the pump. I don't need this plug. This plug, though, is not metric, and I'm willing to bet those threads are. This plug is actually British standard pipe, parallel thread. And the threads, they are somewhat compatible. It's not cross-threading. There is a lot of play in those threads, so definitely not the right part. But there is an O-ring, and it does snug up. So yeah, I think it'll work for now. We do need to get the right part, or at least find out for sure what type of threads these are. But for testing, I think this will do. For the next test, I'm just going to use a test light. The other end is connected to battery positive. And when I touch this pretty much to anything, we're going to pick up a ground or battery negative, and it's going to light the light, including the oil sensor. This tab right here is a source of ground when there's no oil pressure. So if I crank the engine, after a few seconds, it should build pressure and that light will turn off. So I'm going to crank it now. The carb does have fuel in it, but the choke's off. So hopefully the engine doesn't start. And of course we started, but the light did go out. So if I crank it now, see that? And we're dripping fuel on the test light. Probably not a good thing. But at least we know we have oil pressure. And in case you're wondering, the fuel pump's right there. So I was not connected, and that's where the fuel was coming from. And one last thing I want to do before trying this thing out again is double check the fuel pump. Make sure that diaphragm isn't broken. Because that fuel got in the engine somehow. My assumption is the carburetor, but of course, it could be the fuel pump if the diaphragm is damaged. So I just unplugged the pulse line, and we are still plumbed into fuel. So I'm going to turn the fuel valve on. And, the fuel, it is going to gravity feed to the carburetor, but, that's all that should happen. We should not see any fuel coming out of here. And it actually does smell like fuel, so that could be the oil that we took out of the engine that was mostly fuel. So let's give it a few seconds, see if we get any drips of fuel coming out of there. All right. So yeah, nothing obvious coming from this line. I haven't seen anything drip out of it. So one more test we can do is actually pressurize it. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to disconnect the fuel from both sides of the pump. What I want to see is that the diaphragm, if it's intact, it should hold pressure on this side. The diaphragm will hold that back, and we should not see the pressure bleed down. But if the diaphragm is torn, then the pressure will leak out from the pump. So with the fuel lines disconnected, that will give the pressure somewhere to go. And we'll disconnect this line as well. This is probably the more important one because there are check valves in here. It should let fuel flow in one direction, but not the other. So if there is a tear in the diaphragm and the pressure is allowed to get in to the fuel area and the check valves are working, then this is the side that the pressure would push out from. It's quite surprising, actually, how dark the fuel is dripping out. We ran this for a good 3 minutes, so I would have thought that the fuel would be clean. And we saw the opposite of that in the carburetor. So potentially there was a little bit of oil mixed in there. All right, I'm going to pump this up to about 5 PSI. And yeah, we are not building any pressure. So let me just block these ports, see if that makes a difference. And no. So yeah, we could have a problem with the pump. Potentially there is a vent. I know there's a hole right there, but that's just so the diaphragm can move. This should just be an empty cavity. And I think the pressure side is actually on the back side. So let's actually remove these 2 bolts, just get this completely off the machine and take a closer look to see where that pressure is bleeding out. Yeah, there is a vent here on the back side of the pump, so I think that's where the pressure was leaking. If I pump it up, it doesn't hold any pressure, doesn't build any pressure, but if I put my thumb over that hole and do the same test, we're actually holding nice and steady. So I don't think we have a problem with the pump. Likely the original issue was the carb. All right, let's give this thing another try. This time, though, we are outside, so I can run it pretty much as long as needed to get some comfort level that the issues are sorted out. So this time, we are plumbed into external fuel. The fuel level is actually below the level of the carburetor, so that'll be a good test of the fuel pump. And once we get the engine started, we want to pay attention to two things. First off, the engine. Last time we had it running, although the engine sounded good mechanically, it was running rough. You could hear that it was running rich. The engine was shaking quite a bit back and forth. So now that the gasket's installed properly and the issues with the carb have been sorted out, hopefully this time the engine runs a lot smoother. And the second issue, of course, is the blow-by. Now that we have proper oil in there, I don't suspect we're going to continue to have that problem, but let's get the engine started and find out. So I think we're looking pretty good. Both the issues we were chasing seem to be fixed. There is no more engine bogging. And more importantly, there is absolutely no blow-by. So I'm going to pause the video for a second. I'm going to order the parts we need to finish this up. And then we'll get this out for a proper load test. And I forgot to mention the pipe plug actually worked just fine. No oil leaking out of it. So technically we could probably leave it as is. Of course I would like to replace it with the right part if I could. But being that this is a 30-year-old machine, and actually Subaru Robin sold out to Yamaha in 2017. And at that point, production ceased on most of the Subaru engines. But Yamaha is still supporting them. So theoretically, we can get parts. And I guess the one good thing we have going for it is that Yamaha did continue production of some of these Subaru Robin engines, including this model right here. I did find a Yamaha EH63, which appears to be exactly this machine. So likely I can find the parts needed. Regardless, though, we still have things to do. I need to get this cleaned up. We can reassemble it as much as possible. And of course, the tank, that bushing was not in good shape. So let's actually get this back inside. We'll get that tank repaired and get this together the best we can until the parts arrive. All right, so I got the fuel line removed. It's not in too bad a shape. The filter is actually brand new. So we might reuse that. But this absolutely should not be reused. So these are always difficult to get out. You know, it's designed to go in and stay in. And when they get old, they get petrified, and getting them out is even harder. But in this case, the actual bushing is still pliable. It's just that it's torn. So the important thing here is to not damage the tank. You know, the valve can be replaced, and obviously the bushing will be replaced. But the tank, you need to keep safe. Yeah, that was really easy. So that should not have come out like that. And it was actually split in 2 different spots. And the filter is also shot. So even though the valve works, I think we need to just replace the whole thing. So I'm going to use this valve. This is actually for a Briggs & Stratton. And when this generator was made, I think actually Generac was owned by Briggs. So there's a lot of overlap in some of the parts. And for the bushing, pretty much every generator with a plastic tank, takes these standard bushings. I think these came from HIPAA. So I'm going to clean this surface first, get the bushing installed, and push the new valve in place. So we'll get the bushing in. And we need some oil on both parts. And you just push. And you don't have to use oil. You can also use like soap and water. A lot of people are worried that the oil is going to cause damage to the rubber. But this, it is actually nitrile. If it was rubber, it would not hold up to gas or oil. So I'm making an executive decision here. This valve turns way too easy. So I think this one actually might be a clone part. And I don't trust it. I know the old valve worked fine. We just needed a new bushing and a new filter. So the filter, it is removable. So I'm thinking instead of rolling the dice with this one, which likely is going to fail in short time, let's just steal the filter and install the good valve. So brand new valve in the off position. This should build pressure. But as you can see, it doesn't. So a lot of these new valves, they are garbage. Even if they work, they usually work for a very short time. So let's get that old valve installed. Probably should have checked this one too. Yeah, there was actually no fuel in the tank, so I said it was known good. But it wasn't. So, same test. Valve's in the off position, but we can't build any pressure. So unfortunately, the valve I just installed, it's also no good. And I have one other option. Tested this one, also bad. So I might have a fourth option. I actually have some metal valves, which are used in some power mates. But it does use the same bushing, so I don't see any reason why it wouldn't fit this tank. And this is the valve right here. It is a metal valve. These are pretty good. I think the only downside is that, well, these also sometimes leak. But the valve, once installed, it's very close to the tank, so it's a little bit harder to turn it on. There is also a built-in filter. So it should be a good replacement, assuming it holds pressure. So the valve is off. And look at that. We have one that actually works. So yeah, I'm going to struggle for a second, I think, off camera getting this bad valve out. And we'll put in the only good one that I have. And they're a lot easier to install too. Makes me a little nervous, but I haven't had one leak yet. The fuel lines on here are actually in very good shape. There's no cracking or dry rot. So I have no issues reusing this. You know, even the filter Jay said he replaced, so that is basically brand new. So really the only thing I want to replace here are the clamps at either end. The ones around the filter actually look new. So we'll get these rusty ones off, which they do fail when they get rusty. They just snap off and then you don't have really any security holding the line onto the carb or the tank for that matter. Okay, and I'm going to set this aside for now. I'm going to clean up the bottom of the tank while we have access. The top we'll do later once it's installed. And then we'll move on. You know, the generator's been cleaned up quite a bit already by Jay, but now that we have the tank removed, you know, we have access to some areas that he didn't. Looks like we're actually missing a bolt for the exhaust on the back side here. So let me see if I can find something to replace that. So it's kind of hard to show you here, but the missing nut is right there. Without it, you know, the whole exhaust is pretty loose. So I'm kind of surprised actually that it was running as quiet as it was. Anyway, the nut I'm replacing it with, it is an M12 1.25 serrated, so it should stay on there. But I do have a theory as to why the other one was missing. I'll show you that in a second. So the exhaust, it is now nice and secure. So it's actually a good thing that they put a manifold right there. I just assumed this was one piece and it was bolted onto each head. But being the way that it is, it's actually convenient, well, in a way, because the plug over here is right sandwiched between the engine and the exhaust, and there's really no way to service it with this in place. So at least you can remove those two nuts right there, a couple more screws over there, and the muffler should pull out of the way, allowing you to service the plug. And we're also missing a rubber foot, which is kind of an issue on this machine because without it, the engine side's actually about an inch lower down than the stator side. So I do have some extra rubber feet. So let's grab one of those. We'll replace the missing one before moving on. It's cleaning up pretty well. You know, far from perfect, but a lot better than it was. And actually, we never saw what it originally looked like. Jay said this whole machine was just covered in that dirt. And at this point, you know, it's about as clean as it can get without disassembling the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, for its age, I'd say it's in pretty good shape. Anyway, it's going to be a couple weeks before we get the parts, so I don't think there's a whole lot we can do until then, but I am anxious to give this one a try. The generator that is on this machine, it looks a lot like the one that was on that V-twin North Star, and that was one of the rare ones that was actually a low THD generator, I think topping out at about 6%, so I'm anxious to try this one out and see where it stacks up. So it's been about a week, and I did reinstall the handle as well as this bar to protect the exhaust system. You know, I did receive a new air filter, so we're going to get that installed in a minute. And I also ordered a plug of the proper thread. This is an M18 1.5, and I think it's going to thread in there just fine. But now that I'm looking at it more closely, I don't think it's actually going to thread in, or at least not all the way. The threads actually end, before we reach the seal. So most likely this actually isn't going to work. So let's actually start there and see if this plug is going to work for us. So ideally I would have ordered the right plug, but it was actually discontinued, and given that the original broke, a metal plug is probably the way to go. And I take back what I said. I think this plug will fit, although the threads end. It looks to be more narrow, like it's the minor diameter of the thread, or maybe a little smaller. So I'm willing to bet that this will seat on the seal. And yeah, I think that's going to work. So we'll get the new filter in place. And Subaru does call for oil on this foam filter. They actually call for 3 parts kerosene, 1 part motor oil. I'm just going to use motor oil. I'll squeeze the excess out. Then we'll get this closed up. And technically, you could probably use something like this, foam filter oil. It's just a spray-on oil. Usually you see this on like dirt bikes or maybe motorcycles. But for most small engines like this, manufacturers just say to use motor oil. I think Subaru is the big exception. In some of their other engines, they also call for diesel and oil mixed together. So far, so good. The bushing looks nice and dry. And the valve, it is working. I mean, right now, the fuel line is just kind of dangling, and we have no fuel flow, which is perfect. I mean, that is the way it should be. So let's do the final routing of the fuel line and get it reconnected to the pump. It's kind of nice that this generator actually has accommodations to hold the fuel line in place, which kind of makes sense given how close it is to the exhaust. But most manufacturers don't provide any precise routing. So it'd actually be nice if they kind of all did this. Keep the fuel line out of trouble. So at this point, we are more or less done, but there is still one item on order, which is a brand new valve cover on this side of the engine. You know, most sites that I tried to order from said it was a discontinued part, and likely it is, but there were a couple sites that said they could get it, but it would take a couple weeks lead time. So, you know, I placed that order. We'll give them a few weeks and see if that cover shows up. Well, it's been quite some time, actually, since we've looked at this machine. All the video that you've watched up until this point was shot half a year ago. You know, I was waiting for the valve cover, and it did finally show up, but it took about 2.5 months. And when it did finally arrive, I realized the gasket, that part of the order was canceled because it was a discontinued part. So I was able to locate a gasket on eBay. You know, all in, it took about 3 months to get those two parts. And by the time they arrived, I had already moved on. I was working on other projects. So I'm just circling back to this now 6 months later. And, you know, at the time, I did not store this properly because I did not think it was going to be so long to get the parts and back on this project. So let's get the new valve cover on. We'll check the valve clearance while we're in there. And then I do want to start it and just make sure that it still runs well after sitting for 6 months. Hopefully this comes off without issue. Oh yeah, that broke right free. Actually, all these are. So if I remember right, I'm pretty sure I did crack these free before ordering the cover. You know, just given the condition of the cover, yeah, I didn't know if these bolts were gonna come out. And I probably should have ordered new bolts because these do not look great. So might have to run to the hardware store before we get the new cover on, but at least let's get this one off, make sure the one we got is the right part. And we'll check the valves. And I'm kind of debating what to do actually about the other side, because to check the valves, I think it's a lot more involved due to where the exhaust is located. But, you know, if the clearance is off over here, then I think that might influence what we do on the other side. Wow, that came off surprisingly easy. And the gasket didn't rip. Not that we're going to reuse this valve cover, but I might try to save the gasket in case the other side does rip. So just looking at these valves real quick, looks like the intake's open and the exhaust is not, but the exhaust is very tight. Yeah, it feels like it's really close to zero. So I'm going to crank the engine just a bit. I want to make sure this valve is open all the way, or actually either valve is open more or less all the way, and then we'll check and set the other. All right, the intake is open. We can check the exhaust. And according to Subaru, both these valves should be at 4/1000 of an inch, plus or minus 1/1000. So on the exhaust, I would prefer to be on the high side of the spec, which would be 5 thousandths. And that fits with no drag. So does the 6 and the 7 and the 8. So no drag at all. So I would say we are out of spec. Let's just double check with a 9 thousandths. And a 9 does not fit. So yeah, we're about twice what we should be. Okay, so we'll break that free. And we'll adjust this to 5 thousandths. Which is right about there. And we loosened up a bit. So it's actually closer to a 6. So let's bring that in just a little bit more. Feels pretty good. It's a tight 5 and a loose 4. So I'm going to rotate the engine until the exhaust is open, and we'll check and set the intake. All right, I wouldn't call the exhaust convincingly open, but it is open. And the intake clearance seems to be 6,000. So 5 is on the high side, 6 is technically a little bit out of spec. So I'm going to close that up just a little bit. All right, that feels pretty good there. Yeah, 3 fits in there with no drag. 4 feels pretty good. And a 5 does not fit. So both valves on this side are perfect. So let's get the new valve cover on. All right, I've got the new gasket in place. So we'll get the new valve cover on. And I was able to scrounge up a few bolts that I think should fit just fine here. All right, let's try this side. The other side went pretty well, and I'm fairly certain we can sneak this out without pulling the exhaust. But like the other side, these bolts actually pretty loose. And I know I did not break these free. The question is, can we get this last one? And I think the answer is no. Yeah, we got to pull the exhaust. Well, it definitely seems like a lot of unnecessary work just to check the valves. And even with the exhaust there, you can't even really get access to the spark plug either. So I guess while we're here, I'll pull the plug and hopefully I have a new one in stock. If I do, I'll throw that in now, while we have access to it. And like the other side, let's rotate the engine until one valve is open. In this case, the exhaust is open. And we'll check the intake. Should be at 4 thousandths of an inch. So we'll start with the 4. That is loose. 5 does have some drag. And a 6 does not fit. So the intake, it's on the high side of the spec, but it is within spec. So I'm going to leave that alone. Let's double check the exhaust. All right, so let's check the exhaust. 4 fits in with absolutely no drag. So, ideally on the exhaust, we'd be on the high side of the spec at 5 thousandths, but the 5 has no drag either. Neither does the 6 or the 7. 8 might have a little bit. And nothing on the 9. So we're at 8 currently. I think we should close that up a little bit and get it closer to 5. Yeah, 5 fits in there pretty good. Good amount of drag. And the 4 is loose. So the exhaust is perfect. So let's get the cover back on. I'm going to get this plug swapped out if we can. And then we'll get everything back together. Yeah, I wouldn't say the plug looks great. I mean, it's not rusted or corroded, but definitely the engine has been running rich, and I'd say this plug's been in there for a long time. The good news is it is a BPR 6ES, which is the same thing that Honda and Honda clones run. So I've got those in stock. So I'm going to get a new plug in there, as well as the other side, and then I think we'll be good to go. Actually, I'm going to swap the plug type out. We pulled out a BPR 6ES, which is fairly typical on a lot of small engines. But according to the manual I'm looking at for this engine, they actually call for a BPR 4ES, which is a much hotter plug. Or I shouldn't say much hotter, but it's 2 steps hotter. And although I don't have a 4ES, I do have a little bit hotter at a 5ES. So we're going to go with this one instead. So get this plug installed. And this should also help with that carbon buildup that we were seeing on the 6ES. The hotter plug will help burn that off. All right, so I ended up pulling the plug on this side as well. So now both are matched with a BPR 5ES, and both cylinders are adjusted as far as the valves go. So let's crank the engine and see, after sitting for 6 months, if it starts and how well it runs. All right, let's try to start it. Fuel valve's been turned back on. Choke is on. Not a good sign. Yeah, no signs of life. Let me double check the fuel in the tank. Thought we put some in there. Yeah, definitely plenty of fuel in the tank. So yeah, we'll crank it a little bit more, but it's not looking good. Yeah, and we get no signs of life, so yeah, shouldn't have let it sit for so long. So I'm going to get the airbox cover off, get a little bit of fuel right in the intake. I'm hoping it's just bad fuel in the carburetor, but once we run a little bit of good fuel through the system, that might clear out. Otherwise, we might have to go back in and clean things up. Yeah, it's not looking good. And it's not running on its own. So either the carb is not getting fuel or it's clogged up again. I think we're going to be okay, but let's just try to restart it and make sure. I think we're going to be okay. It was definitely hard starting, but it did finally start and actually ran pretty well. So I'm going to swap the fuel out, and then we'll get it outside for a load test. Yeah, fuel color does not look that bad. And actually, I didn't put a lot of fuel in here either, so the hard starting could have been just due to that. Yeah, there was barely any fuel in here at all. So let's instead top this off before trying to do the load test. So what do you think? Will this engine pull a 10,000 watt load? And is this a low THD generator? Of those questions, I am not sure, but I am very curious about this generator. It looks more or less the same as the generator used on the North Star generators, and that one was pretty low. I think around 5% THD, and I'm hoping we're going to see the same here. So let's get the engine started. While it's warming up, we'll double check the output using the kilowatt to measure the voltage and the frequency. We've got the amp probe to measure the total harmonic distortion and the oscilloscope to see what the output looks like. Assume everything checks out, we'll put on about a half load. We'll give it some time. And if everything looks good, we'll go for the max at 10,000 watts. Well, definitely a bit of a rough start. The engine stalled out, and it was a pretty abrupt stall. I kind of thought maybe we lost spark, but the engine did restart, and it surged for a good minute to maybe minute and a half. But at this point, the surging is pretty much gone. Engine speed is fairly stable. THD, we're actually starting higher than I would have hoped for. We're at 6% THD. And the sine wave doesn't look great, so this may not be a low THD machine, but I guess we need to put a load on it to find out for sure. So let's start with 2,000 watts, 3,000, 4,000, and definitely a bit unstable on the engine speed, so we're going to have to keep an eye on that. THD 7.7, not terrible, and the sine wave looks about the same. So let's give this a few minutes, and if things stabilizes, which it looks like it has, we'll go for more to see how much this machine can take. Well, it's been a few minutes and no issues at all, pulling 4,000 watts. So let's bring the load up to 6,000 watts, 8,000 watts. Yeah, engine speed is nice and stable. 9,000, 9,500, 10,000 watts. Yeah, it's doing it pretty convincingly. And under a full load, we're at 8.6%, so not too bad. And the sine wave looks okay. You know, I've seen better, but the THD, not too bad. Well, I'd say that's a pass. No issues at all pulling 10,000 watts. Kind of wish I had more to throw at it, because I think it would do it. Anyway, I'm going to take the load off. Although the one thing to note is that the voltage did drop a little bit under full load. So let's see where it's at now. Under 8,000 watts, we're at 240 volts, which actually is pretty good. And under full load, 10,000 watts. You can see we're definitely at the limit, so the voltage came down to 229 volts. So still acceptable, and even if the engine can handle more, you know, the generator can't. That voltage is going to keep dropping, but since it's only rated at 10,000 watts, I think we're looking pretty good. So I'm going to take the load off, we'll give it a minute for things to cool down, and then we'll shut it down. All right, guys, and that is pretty much it. You know, this one, we definitely took the long road. It was a nice summer day when we started, and now it is a late winter day, but definitely worth the wait. This Subaru Robin V-twin engine had no issues at all pulling its rated load of 10,000 watts, and the generator, I was hoping it would be low THD, meaning less than 6%, and although we didn't hit that criteria, it's also not too bad. You know, we topped out at about 8.5%, which is better than most machines I test. So overall, you know, this generator performed very well, and definitely a machine worth saving. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.